Depending on the live stream to YouTube, which is where people will go who, if we get more than 500 participants, they'll get automatically sent across to the live stream. Just a reminder, if everybody has their webinar, oh, sorry, it's now talking to me. I'll have to, how do I turn off the sound? Mute, there we go. I could hear myself talking in the live stream. So make sure you've got your webinar chat window open so we can contact you if we need to. As I say, Deb and Marina and I are going to turn off our microphones and our videos, and you can contact us via the chat, and then it'll all go live. You'll hear it say once I start the webinar, which I'll do right on at midday. So cool. Good luck. I think we're all over it. It's going to be great.
Go well, everyone. It's going to be good. Here's some background noise.
Yeah, Deb, can you please mute yourself?
It wasn't me.
Oh, there you go. Okay, here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on working with LGBTQ+ people impacted by coercive control and really exploring what practitioners need to know. My name's Karen Bevan and I'm the CEO of Full Stop Australia, but more importantly, I have the privilege of being your facilitator for this webinar. Welcome to all of our participants online. We know that many of you have attended previous webinars. Welcome back. And many of you might be coming for the first time, so I hope that you enjoy our session today. Before we begin, as always, on behalf of myself and all of the other presenters and participants today, I want to pay deep respect and acknowledgement to Aboriginal people, colleagues, organisations and communities. I acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the land of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the mighty Eora Nation. It's a privilege to be always on the land of these people who were particularly impacted by colonisation and first contact. I'd like to acknowledge that across the country, people are joining from New South Wales and sometimes we have people sneaking in from other states. I'd like to acknowledge the countries that you're all coming into from today. And as part of this acknowledgement, I and my colleagues and CCWT, our organisers, commit to active allyship, listening, learning and reflecting on the steps we need to take to drive meaningful and lasting change. I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal elders, past and present. I'd like to acknowledge all Aboriginal people, including brother boys and sister girls, as we acknowledge also that Aboriginal communities have the oldest living continuous trans and gender diverse culture. I'd like to particularly acknowledge that when we talk about domestic violence and coercive control, the impact of colonialism has played out significantly, impacting Aboriginal people of all genders very deeply, and that's part of the work that we have to do in our drive towards making real change. I'd also like to acknowledge victim survivors of domestic and family and sexual violence, including any attending today, and note and celebrate the variety of ways that victim survivors resist violence in both overt and covert ways. We recognise the lives that have been taken because of the choice of many to use violence, and we acknowledge the need for systems to make profound change to uphold the safety and dignity of women, men, and people of all genders as well as children, in order to make sure that we can respond effectively. We acknowledge the victim survivors who have led and advocated for the criminalisation of coercive control, and acknowledge how hard they have worked to make this practice more effective. Today, we're here because on July 1, 2024, a new coercive control offence was commenced under Part 3, Division 6A of the Crimes Act. That section prescribes an offence of abusive behaviour towards current or former intimate partners, where an adult engages in a course of conduct of abusive behaviour that is intended to coerce or control the other person. This is commonly referred to as the coercive control offence, and is punishable by up to 7 years imprisonment, although we've yet to see that. CCWT, in partnership with DCJ, have developed coercive control training to equip New South Wales practitioners with the knowledge and skills to identify and respond to coercive control, and I know many of you will have had the chance to participate. Over 2,000 practitioners across the state have participated in that training. What people want to know about has really driven the decisions about what we focus on in this webinar series, and working with LGBTQ plus communities has been a strong demand driver. People really want to know about how they can improve their practice in this space. So we're delighted today to bring you a range of speakers who will address that. Some very quick housekeeping. We've got 90 minutes today, and we will use every one of those minutes. This webinar, however, is being recorded and will be available for later access. Closed captions automatically turn on, so if you don't want to see them, you can turn it off at the square at the bottom of the screen where it says CC for closed captions. If you have specific questions, please submit them via the Q&A function anytime during the webinar, and we'll address them if we can during the dedicated Q&A at the end. At the end of the session, we will provide links to resources and encourage you to complete a short feedback survey. So look, a couple of things. This session today really focuses on how LGBTQ plus community members might be impacted or experience coercive control, and how practitioners can respond. We will hear from a couple of really impressive experts in the field, and this will give us, an opportunity to open up avenues of conversation. We're really focused today on a number of objectives, which I'm sure you've seen. I won't read them all out, but I hope by the end of this session that you feel more confident to understand the particular experience of LGBTQ plus people who use your services and seek support, and also have some insights into the incredible diversity of the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and how where you can find more information to help you respond in those very person-centered ways to people who seek your support. Today we'll start with a keynote presentation from Jade Parker, the Acting Manager of Sexual, Domestic and Family Violence at ACON. ACON is an organisation that many of you will be familiar with, much loved here in New South Wales, which works with to create opportunities for people in diverse communities to live their healthiest lives. Jade will explore some of the issues at the core of LGBTQ plus community experiences of coercive control, as well as some of the challenges they might experience in accessing support services. Look, we'll then move on to an interactive panel with some impressive guests. We've got Cecilia Henry from the Inner City Legal Centre and Star Lady from the Zoe Bell Gender Collective, and they'll share some incredible insights and look at some of the key questions that we know people have. We'll then look at some audience Q&A. So at that point, I'll go to your questions. And the questions we don't get to, we'll seek to answer after the webinar. So then we'll close with a few quick key takeaways, available resources and information on upcoming webinars. So before we start, I want to kind of set a bit of a frame. We want to think about language and how we use language. We know as practitioners in this space that this is critical in our work. And we're asking throughout this session to reflect on how they use language and its power. Think about how we might also need to challenge others in the space, and be thoughtful about how we think about how we use language. And we would also ask you to remain open and curious to learning. I would like to mention that today, of course, we will be discussing coercive control and domestic and family violence. This can be deeply sensitive and for some may bring up a range of feelings. If at any time you feel overwhelmed, please take a break, look after your well-being, and use the strategies that you know work for you. You could also, of course, reach out to a support service such as 1-800-RESPECT or 1-800-FULL-STOP or any of the helplines that might support your needs. If you would like an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander specific crisis support service, you can call 13-YARN on 139276. Okay, let's move on. I'd like to kick off with our first speaker and panelist, Jade Parker. As I mentioned, Jade is the Acting Manager of Sexual, Domestic and Family Violence in ACON and is well known across New South Wales for their work in domestic and family violence. Thank you for your time, Jade, and I'll hand straight over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. I appreciate that. So hi everyone, I'm Jade. I use they, them pronouns. I work at ACON. I've been there for about 4 years, and I'm here to talk to you about LGBTQ plus people's experiences of coercive control. I've got someone from CCWT who's going to share the slides. So I'm going to assume that there's been a bit of a tech moment, unless you can see them. Oh, here they come. Beautiful. All right, wonderful. And just before I jump into it, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of all the different lands on which we're gathering. I am on the lands of the Wadi people of Dharawal country, and I'd like to collectively pay our respects to elders and ancestors, both past and present, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. Next slide, please, Liz. So we're going to start talking a little bit to the acronym. So the term LGBTQIA+ is used to refer to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, asexual people, and other people who have diverse genders and sexualities or innate variations of sex characteristics. Sometimes the acronym is expanded to include SB, which stands for Sister Girl and Brother Boy, which are terms that are used in some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and it describes gender diverse people who have a female or a male spirit and take on those roles within their community. It's really important for us to understand and use language and terminology that is trusted with LGBTQIA+ people and acknowledges and respects that diversity is a normal part of life and a celebrated part of life. And it also helps to reduce stigma and discrimination and ensures that services, practitioners, and organisations are inclusive, respectful, and creating safe spaces. Now, as seen in the webinar flyer for today, ACON generally will use the initialism LGBTQ+, and we choose to defer to intersex-led organisations to support and speak on behalf of intersex communities. We always recommend Interaction, which is Australia's leading peak body and organisation for the intersex community, and we also endorse the Darlington Statement. Notwithstanding this position, the information in the webinar today may be applicable to LGBTQIA+ people across Australia. It's also really important that when we're talking about LGBTQ+ people, to acknowledge that there's lots of different intersecting backgrounds within our communities, and every single person will have a different experience. So, for instance, the impact of racism and colonisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members will affect both their experience of violence as well as their access to support afterwards. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brother boys, sister girls, trans and queer mob often face greater and more nuanced barriers when seeking support after experiences of violence. And so on our next slide, we're going to watch a video which speaks to sexual violence, but it's really applicable to coercive control and all forms of violence since the invasion of Australia. Next slide, please, Liz.
The impact of racism and colonisation on access to support for Aboriginal community members.
Disclosing sexual violence is never easy.
And there are a lot of reasons why people might not choose to formally report it.
Some members of the LGBTQ communities face greater barriers to reporting violence and accessing support services.
This is true for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brother boys, sister girls, trans and queer mob.
Colonisation brought big changes to our ways of life, disrupting our cultures, societies, and disconnecting us from our lands. But it's important to understand that the impacts of colonisation didn't just fade away with time.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to experience mistreatment, injustices and systemic discrimination that affect our daily lives. There's a long and an ugly history of discrimination, police brutality, profiling and violence caused by systems and policies that were put in place in this country.
Many people in our communities may have a distrust of justice, police and health systems and feel unsafe seeking support from them. Reporting to the police could bring a very real fear of increased surveillance, targeting, or harassment.
We may also fear not being believed, that our reports will be not taken seriously, or our experiences will be downplayed. For many generations, our voices have been silenced.
And we have faced discrimination for just being ourselves.
Colonisation attempted to erase our identities, both as blackfellas and as brother boys, sister girls, trans and queer mob. And many of us have experienced the lasting effects of this through unfair treatment.
It is really helpful and supportive to educate yourself about colonisation and racism and how it affects our experiences.
Responding to a disclosure.
It takes a lot of courage to disclose sexual violence, and there are many ways you can support someone who chooses to disclose to you.
One of the most important things you can do is to believe them and let them know that you support them. Respect their boundaries and privacy, and yarn with them about how they want to be supported. Sometimes just having someone to listen helps. They may want help to find services that are inclusive and culturally safe, or someone to attend appointments with.
Encourage them to do things that support their well-being, like connecting with country. This could look like going to your local park to sit on the grass in the afternoon sun, or heading to your local beach to put your feet in the sand.
Our cultures have always been inclusive and affirming, and our communities find strength and resilience in collective care.
Reaching out to a trusted elder or community member can be incredibly healing.
Brother boys, sister girls, trans and queer mob have unique cultural and spiritual connections, roles and responsibilities that have been deeply woven into our communities for hundreds of thousands of years.
And we deserve support and services that recognise, respect and validate all our identities.
We have always been here.
And we always will be.
All right. I've heard that some of you could not see the video. Apologies for that, but you've heard it. It's a really beautiful video, and there are lots more that can be found on the Say It Out Loud website, and they'll be in the pack after this webinar as well. So don't worry, you'll definitely be able to see them. So now we're just going to have a look at some of the data from La Trobe University's research series, Private Lives. So this is the current largest national study that has ever focused on the health and wellbeing of LGBTQ+ people. So in 2019, Private Lives 3, they collected data from just under 7,000 LGBTQ+ respondents who are aged 18 to 80+ years from a wide range of genders and sexualities. And they found that 3 in 5, or 61%, had ever experienced violence from an intimate partner. So during this survey, the respondents were asked to indicate whether they had ever experienced physical violence, sexual assault, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, harassment or stalking, damage to property, social isolation, threats of suicide and self-harm from intimate partners or family members. And they were also asked about LGBTQ+ related abuse. So this can include being shamed about being LGBTQ+, having threats to out you or out your HIV status, or withhold hormones or other gender affirming care from you. And when compared to the questions that were asked generally about violence, when the specific forms of violence were explicitly listed, the proportion of people who reported having experienced violence increased from 42% to 61% for intimate partner violence. And it was also found that experiences of intimate partner or family violence were more common for LGBTQ+ people with disability. And while this sample is the biggest sample we've had nationally, it hasn't been an ongoing piece of research. And so there really needs to be more funding given to ongoing population level surveys, so we can make sure that the data that's being captured is in fact generalizable to all LGBTQ+ people across Australia. Next slide, please, Liz. So what is coercive control? It's when someone repeatedly hurts, scares, or isolates another person in order to control them. It's domestic abuse, and it can cause serious and ongoing harms. It's also an ongoing and repeated pattern of behaviour, and it can happen in all kinds of structures, so whether that be monogamy, polyamory, kink, BDSM settings, everything. It can happen anywhere. It could be a family member, a person you live with, like a roommate, a friend, or someone who provides care for you. But no matter what setting it happens in, coercive control is deliberate and it's wrong in all relationships. It's also an assault on a person's autonomy, liberty, and equity and equality. So coercive control, it differs from some episodic forms of violence because it's really intentional and it has the aim of dominating and controlling people. Coercive control can also occur in the context of other intersectional factors such as race, age, sexuality, gender, location, disability, culture, community, and it can look different in each individual relationship. So behaviours that might not appear intimidating or worrisome to an outsider may actually have immense significance to those involved in the relationship. It's important to note that LGBTQ+ people who use violence in their relationships, they use the same tactics to gain power and control as people who are using violence in heterosexual relationships, which can include, but isn't limited to, physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, abuse, financial control, isolation, intimidation, threats, and more. And every time a person uses abusive behaviours, they're making the conscious choice to do so, and they are responsible for the abuse and for the consequences of it. Next slide, please. So the drivers of violence in LGBTQ+ relationships are gendered, and they are caused by rigid expectations of gender and the privileging of heterosexual cisgender masculinity. Negative and discriminatory social attitudes, norms, and behaviours towards LGBTQ+ people influence the violence against LGBTQ+ people, which is inclusive of intimate partner violence between LGBTQ+ people. So rigid gender norms and gender inequality, which drive violence against women, including lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer women, are founded on the social constitution of stereotypical roles for men and women within heterosexual intimate relationships. And so addressing the gender drivers of violence for LGBTQ+ people can actually challenge many of the key ideas that drive violence against women. Next slide, please. Some additional drivers of violence for LGBTQ+ people include heteronormativity, which refers to the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and that heterosexuality is the only normal and natural expression of sexuality. And the other driver is cisgenderism, which is the assumption that everyone is cisgender, which means that their gender aligns with what they were assigned to at birth, or the assumption that somebody's body parts equates to what their gender is, and that people can only be a man or a woman, and that strict binary gender roles are enforced upon the man or the woman. So cisgenderism and heteronormativity, they often erase LGBTQ+ experiences of violence. And this means that some LGBTQ+ people, they don't actually realize they've experienced violence because it doesn't look like what a cisgender heterosexual man abusing or harassing a cisgender heterosexual woman looks like. And this can also make LGBTQ+ people feel like our experiences aren't as valid or aren't as serious, that they won't be believed if they're reported or disclosed to people. Next slide, please. So everyone can experience or use coercive control, though I acknowledge that the use of coercive control is gendered and it does disproportionately affect women, and mostly women from diverse backgrounds. For LGBTQ+ people, there are some unique experiences of coercive control that non-LGBTQ+ people might not have heard of. And these unique forms of coercive control are called identity-based abuse. Identity-based abuse specifically aims to change, minimize, or silence a person's identity independent of the user of violence. And it can include, but is not limited to, the withholding of finances for medical services or items for expressing gender, body shaming, so that can include saying or implying a trans person isn't a real man or a woman, the targeting of gendered body features during violence, using homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia to assert power and control, misgendering on purpose and pressuring a person to follow gender norms, such as telling them to dress a certain way or stopping them from affirming their gender in the way that feels good to them. There can also be controlling or threatening to reveal information about healthcare, which can include gender-affirming healthcare, fertility treatments, and other medications for like mental health issues. There can also be threats to out the person based on their gender, their sexuality, their intersex status, or their HIV status. This particularly can happen in the workplace. I think most recent data was 35% of LGBTQ+ people are out at work. So threats to or actual isolation of a victim survivor from their affirming communities. So this can be like not letting your partner attend an LGBTQ+ event, or if it's a trans partner, cutting them off from their friends who are trans as well. Then there can be exiling a person from a family, jeopardizing them financially due to their sexuality or gender, forcing a person into conversion practices, even though this is now illegal in New South Wales, it can still happen, and discouraging help seeking. So this can happen by using people's knowledge of homophobia in, mainstream society to influence them not to attend a service, or using someone's past experiences with service provision and being like, oh, they're not going to believe you. You've already had an experience, reaching out and no one believed you then. So what will make them believe you now? Next slide, please. So now we have a video about intimate partner violence in LGBTQ+ relationships. So hopefully we'll be able to play that.
We live in a world in which we see the gendered framing of intimate partner violence, and we know that to be true, that it's a gendered crime, but we don't necessarily have that nuanced understanding of how that plays out in LGBTQ relationships, and that they actually do play out, some in the same ways and some in unique ways to our relationships as well. To increase community readiness in the LGBTQ community to be able to access services and to identify intimate partner violence means that we really need to strengthen our communities. And the way that we do that is by funding programs, prevention campaigns, education campaigns to really increase people's understanding of not only what a violent relationship might look like, but also a real strengths-based, ethical and non-violent relationship and what that looks like, because it really starts from there.
I think it's important to make the point that the type of violence that we see and the tactics that we see in violence in straight relationships, we absolutely see those in LGBTQ relationships. But it's an important question to think about, that there are absolutely unique tactics. And the one that is kind of foremost or comes to mind immediately is around identity-based violence or identity-based coercion or threats. That for some LGBTQ people, being out in the workplace or being out to family or being out in community is not possible or frightening. And for that to be used as a threat, a coercive threat, or a way to control somebody, a way to socially isolate somebody.
Other tactics of abuse include denying a transgender person access to hormones or purposely dead naming them or misgendering them. It can include threats to exclude them or isolate them from an LGBT safe space or community in the event that a relationship ends. It can also include using a person's internalized homophobia or the trauma that they've experienced as a result of being an LGBTQ person against them.
I think LGBTQ people haven't always had the best experience of service access. So I think that's another way that violence can occur in relationships, where a perpetrating partner may capitalize on that and say, listen, don't bother going to services because they're not going to understand you, or they're not going to listen, they're not going to be able to help. So cutting off that kind of what is essentially a lifeline for a lot of people in terms of help seeking.
I've also just received a note from our wonderful hosts. So if you're having any tech difficulties, they're telling me that you can access the YouTube link and that it might be easier for you to view the webinar via that link. So sorry for any issues anyone is having. So now we'll chat a little bit about barriers to LGBTQ plus people seeking help. So as we've heard, there are many complexities around help seeking, disclosure, and reporting violence for LGBTQ plus people. And this can be much more complex to people who experience multiple marginalizations, such as a heterosexual trans woman or a bi-plus man of color. So barriers to accessing services exist at societal, institutional, and individual levels, and they can include inequitable and ambiguous legislation, judgmental and prejudiced social and cultural attitudes, inadequate theories of domestic violence dynamics, heterosexist language, implicit and explicit attitudes of clients, staff, and legal authorities, stigma, risk of outing, community ties, and re-victimization. So research tells us about a variety of barriers for LGBTQ plus people who are reporting sexual domestic family violence and seeking help. A lot of this stems from cisgenderism and heteronormativity, including homophobia, transphobia, and a general fear of discrimination. Trans people and trans women of colour in particular are keenly aware that they are navigating a service environment where there has been significant public debate over whether services that predominantly support cisgender women experiencing violence ought to extend to support trans women. And LGBTQ plus people who might be wishing to change violent and abusive behaviours can also face barriers to accessing support to change their behaviour through appropriate interventions. A lot of these services are, of course, often referred to as men's behaviour change programs, and this may not reflect perpetrator identities. There are a couple of all gender groups that are happening across Australia, but really not enough. So that's a barrier for a lot of people accessing, help to change. And then also existing literature has shared a number of reasons why victim survivors in general may struggle to name what's being done to them as abuse. So someone experiencing SDFE may not want to name the person who is abusing them as a perpetrator. And this could be because they may love them, they're attracted to them, or they share a familial relationship with the person. People experiencing violence might also not want to take on the label of victim, with the vulnerability, stigma, or shame that term can connotate. It can also be difficult to describe individual incidents as something that they see as serious enough to report, and that are recognised by others as abuse, even while experiencing considerable psychological and emotional harm from sustained patterns of controlling behaviour. So there's this real high threshold, if you will, to abuse from people who have often experienced minority stress and ongoing discrimination throughout their lifetime. Some additional barriers include the strong sense of solidarity within LGBTQ plus communities. So not wanting to bring a negative light to the community from external judgment. There can also be reluctance in general to report and expose their partner to a hostile, justice system. There can be frustration in explaining LGBTQ plus identities, relationships, bodies, and sexual practices to mainstream staff. There's a strong mistrust of police and the criminal justice system generally due to historical discrimination. And LGBTQ plus people can feel a lot less secure in telling others about their experiences of violence because they're not sure whether others are going to take their accounts seriously. This can particularly be seen in instances where it's two women in a relationship, because often women are painted as, submissive and not capable of violence. There's also belief for, if it's two men in a relationship, that a man should be able to fight back, even during controlling and abusive relationship tactics and behaviors. There's also the conception that men can't be raped, which is something that people who are experiencing sexual violence really struggle with when trying to seek support. There's also general, trauma and minority stress that is experienced by our communities. There's experiences of family rejection and other forms of family of origins violence. Of course, the historical framing of violence against women in Australia and the funding contracts which can limit service availability for all members of our communities can also be difficult to navigate. And there can be a lack of inclusive communication, and some people are just unclear about which services are they actually able to go to and seek support from. There's also this real fear of taking space away from cisgender heterosexual women, because a lot of community does acknowledge that it's gendered violence, and so they feel like they can't access a service because they'll be taking away a place from someone who might need it more than them. So those are some of the things that are real barriers to receiving the care and support that people need. Next slide, please. So I thought we might talk a little bit about some key principles for affirming practice with LGBTQ plus people. So there's lots of different things that people can do. So the first thing is you can signal safety. So these are quite small things. So it's like having a badge with like an ally sticker on it, or having the flags, in your office, posters that show LGBTQ plus people. You can share your pronouns, whether that's in your email signature or on a name badge. You can join, accreditation programs such as the Welcome Here project or Rainbow Tick. But you do have to make sure that if you're joining those, you're not being tokenistic. So making sure that you really are looking at your policies and your practices, looking at your intake forms, just making sure that all staff are trained and upskilled and feeling really confident and able to talk to LGBTQ plus people. Intake forms is a pretty big one. I find that it is honestly the first signifier about whether a service is inclusive. So like I'm a non-binary person. So if I go into a service and it's got what's your gender, male, female, automatically I'm not included in the intake form. So it's like you then have to explain who you are, what it means, like what support you need. And if someone's coming to you from a traumatized, instance, that's really hard to be able to advocate for yourself in those ways. So intake forms are a really big one. There's a resource on TransHub about how you can do inclusive intake forms, and I'd really recommend checking that out. You can also join a network. So there's an LGBTQ plus domestic family violence interagency that you can join. ACON convenes it once a month, and it's a place for people to come across New South Wales, chat online, keep updated about what's happening for community, share events and, opportunities to work together. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to send an email. But yeah, those are some really great ways you can signal safety to community. The other thing you can do is shine a light. So this involves looking inwards at your own understandings Do you maybe have any misassumptions or biases that could be harmful or frightening to an LGBTQ plus person? And then doing some reflective practice around that and sort of unpacking it, whether that's with your external supervisor or in your own time through, you know, journaling and mindfulness. Do no harm. So think about what you say and how it might be heard for an LGBTQ plus person. Language, it really builds trust. So try and mirror language where possible. So if an LGBTQ plus person, you know, refers to their chest instead of their breast, make sure you also refer to it as their chest. You know, like things like that. That's really important. And actively look for barriers that you can decrease or eliminate. So this can be things like if your service needs to use the legal name of someone, but that person uses a different name, explaining to them that that's the case and that you'll make a note on their file that they want to be called by, you know, their name that they've chosen, and make sure you communicate that to other staff members. That can be really helpful, and some advocacy that you can do in your day-to-day work. So you can also say something. So you can challenge negative stereotypes and discrimination as you hear them. This can be done through simply interrupting someone, questioning why it's being said or asked, educate why it's a problem, and express general support for LGBTQ plus people. This can be especially powerful for trans communities. So I find it really helpful if I'm in a meeting and someone misgenders me. It's actually really refreshing when somebody else is like, hey, actually, Jade's pronouns are they, them. And it just takes the burden off of me to then have to do that self-advocacy work all the time. So just things like that, I feel like, you know, cisgender people, I really want you to feel empowered to be able to say those things and be there for community, because we're really nothing without our allies. So that's something that's really important, I feel. We can also lead with compassion, which I'm sure all of you are already doing, but it still bears to say, you know, that we try to respond to the needs of all people, acknowledge diversity, respect it, and be really aware of equity instead of always equality. So some people will need extra support than others, and that's okay. People need to feel able to come to your service with their whole self and not have to hide bits of themselves to get, you know, compassionate care. Next slide, please. So what do inclusive, safe and affirming sexual domestic family services look like in practice? We touched on a few of these just before, but I thought I would, you know, chat to you about some evidence-based stuff from La Trobe University's Opening Doors research, which is really great. If you have time, I do recommend having a flick through it. It's super practical. I think it'll be really helpful for everyone who works in the space. But some key things that they outlined in their research was using people's correct pronouns, uptaking, oh my goodness, English is my first language and yet it escapes me. Updating intake forms to be inclusive, acceptance and affirmation of a client's gender and sexuality, not asking any invasive questions or making them feel pressured to defend who they are. Their gender presentation or any of their intimate or social relationships is really important. Also not assuming people's gender or the gender of their partner or partners is another key one. Believing LGBTQ plus clients accounts for sexual domestic family violence and validating their need for care and support, making sure they know that they're very welcome in this space and that support is there for them and it's okay that they need support, I think is a really big one as well. So also using complementary forms of knowledge and expertise. So you will all have a basic understanding of trauma-informed and person-led care. So really relying on those sorts of theoretical frameworks to guide your work with LGBTQ plus people is really important. You can also bespoke tailored responses, so not preempting needs and meet the clients where they're at. So asking, you know, how do you want to be supported? What can I do for you? And then if they're a little bit, if they're a little confused, then you can give them a couple of different options for what that might entail. So you can also enable choice in referrals. So that can be by having an internal referral list for safe and affirming professionals. This is really important, especially if you are a service who is restricted by funding. So if you can only, like have trans women and cis women in your service, if like a trans man comes up or a non-binary person comes up to you, it would be really great if you have got a list of affirming practitioners you can then refer them on to. It takes some of the burden off of them, which is really important, of course, when you're going through trauma. Next slide, please. You can also seek help and advice from LGBTQ plus organisations. So in New South Wales, of course, there's ACON, there's the Gender Centre, ICLC, 2010. I'm sure there's heaps more of us, but I'm on a time limit, so I can't list them all off. But please do always feel free, if you're not sure about something, just reach out, and we're really friendly. I promise we'll be really happy to just have like a one-on-one chat with you and talk you through anything that you might feel unsure of. And we've got, loads of resources that we can share with you as well. So you can also get your policies and procedures reviewed. You can do that through consultants or by getting in contact with LGBTQ plus orgs, and we can give you feedback about how to keep it inclusive. Also, raising awareness of LGBTQ plus experiences of violence and coercive control generally is really helpful, and building long-term community trust and rapport and remaining accountable to community is also key. Next slide, please. So it's also really important to provide worker names prior to a service. This is because the LGBTQ plus community is quite tight-knit, and it can be difficult to attend a group where it turns out it's like your ex-partner facilitating. And that has happened in my personal experience. So it's really important to make sure that people have all the info before they show up to a support service. You can also reduce time in waiting areas where possible. This will help people who aren't out. Develop the capacity to provide training and increase referral safety, reflective practice, of course, and correcting one another if people accidentally make a mistake. And it's okay to make a mistake, we all do. It's just about apologizing, correcting your mistake and moving on. And then planning responses to resistance as well can be something that's really helpful. Next slide, please. So I just want to leave you with a few last messages. So listen to and amplify LGBTQ plus voices and our experiences of coercive control, and include us in the conversation. This is really important because of the invisibility of LGBTQ plus experiences. So it's important to specifically name some of those forms of identity-based abuse as examples of harm. And this can actually facilitate improved understanding of the needs of LGBTQ plus people across the sector, wider community, and it can help LGBTQ plus people themselves understand that those things are violence and they count. I also wanted to share with you a powerful call to action from Star Lady, who you are going to hear from later, but I just always really love to share this beautiful wording that she shares with everyone. So Zoe Bell Gender Collective is calling upon our allies to acknowledge and address the growing levels of trans misogyny and transphobia within our society. Recent incidents of transphobic discourse, political attacks and violence have increased, and they've created an atmosphere of fear and distress within the trans and gender diverse community. Many people have legitimate concerns for their or their friends and family's safety and well-being, and the centering of trans misogyny within broader attacks on the trans and gender diverse community can leave many trans women and non-binary trans feminine people feeling vulnerable and isolated. Strength-based messaging that communicates love, support, and solidarity are vital. And as representatives of a diverse collective of trans women and trans femmes, we loudly advocate for your support and improved understanding of the needs of LGBTQ plus people across the sector. Thank you very much for listening and learning with me today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to hand back over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Jade. What an incredibly broad and detailed presentation. And I think, those some really key things that Jade talked about today are about, starting from that respectful position that LGBTQ plus communities bring diverse experiences, are not able to be wrapped up as a single group, but actually the work we know matters, which is exploring with people their lived experience, is the work that will build inclusion. So critical. Also, that as services, we know we will make mistakes and we know that our work is not always perfect. That doesn't excuse us from taking responsibility and seeking to do better, calling one another out, and deeply, taking on that invitation to allyship. I think there's so much out of Jade's presentation. I'm sure you're all, deep in the detail. Please pop your questions in the chat for us to answer. We're going to move now and invite the rest of our panel in. We're so delighted to introduce Cecilia Henry, who's a lawyer from the Inner City Legal Centre in Potts Point. That service is a not-for-profit legal service which has a strong history and reputation, specialising in the support of LGBTQ plus people and communities. I'd also welcome Cecilia. I'd also like to welcome Star Lady, the director of the Zoe Bell Gender Collective, and we've already heard a little bit from Star Lady through Jade. ZBGC, Zoe Bell Gender Collective, is a trans and gender diverse service-led advocacy organisation providing a wide range of services and training. And of course, Jade will join our panel as well. So I'm going to jump in now. Cecilia, as you know, a lawyer working in this space and with some of that particular insight, can you tell us a little bit about the coercive control legislation and some of the thoughts, the sort of key issues we need to consider? And I know we've got some slides that our colleagues will be sharing.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you, Jade. What an amazing expansive information we can all draw on. And I'm just, my head's still boggling with it because there's a lot there. And, it's all a work in progress. And you're right, we're all learning together. It's incredible. Okay, look, welcome to the boring bit, I'm afraid. This is the legislation. We will go through it. I promise I'll try and make it a little bit more interesting and just give you some take-home points, just something which is succinct and sharp, things to look for and things to look out for when you are in a situation where you can help someone in our vulnerable communities. If we could go to the slide, please, Liz, the first slide we have. So this is an intro as to what the coercive control legislation did. But before we even get to that, you can probably read that for yourselves while I'm talking. In between 2008 and 2016, there was a study that was done on domestic violent homicides, and it was based over 112 victims within New South Wales, or actually right across the board. And what they found through their data collection was that all of those 112 victims, bar one, displayed that case study of substantial, sustained pattern of controlling and abusive behaviour. And this was a kickstart for this legislation. And bearing in mind, it took 8 years to do that. It's quite an intensive study and going through all those awful cases in this regard. So prior to 1 July 2024, we used to have domestic violence incidents where we were talking about someone is being charged with assault, someone's being charged with harassment or intimidation, sexual assault. From the 1st of July 2024, what we're looking at is the coercive control legislation, which Jade has touched on. It is the course of conduct that we're talking about. So prosecutors don't have to prove every single item and every single offence. What they're looking at is saying that there was a conduct of behaviour which showed that there was control and manipulation that was enforced over a former or a current intimate partner. It is not just physical abuse here. Jade's touched on this too. We've got financial abuse, we've got non-physical abuse, we've got psychological abuse and systemic abuse also that's involved here. It is abuse that is used to hurt, scare, intimidate and threaten other people. And the last point there, the behaviour prior to the commencement of this act of coercive control, the offence, can be used to provide a background and a context to the relationship that was given. There have been quite a few cases to date that have gone through with coercive control. The one that I'm aware of, because, you know, a lot of these things have suppressed, but you're looking at a situation where a male had been in a situation where he was charged with coercive control back in December. The controlling factors were that, yes, he was manipulative, it was inside the house, it was with the children who were present. And this is with a heterosexual couple, I might add, but it's the only report that I could find. What we did have was padlocked doors and just abusive language and controlling, particularly with the phone. When the actual charge was laid, the perpetrator said that he wasn't a violent person, but he would plead guilty just to get this over and done with. In fact, there was mention in the evidence that he had said to the perpetrator, tonight is your last night, I am going to murder you. Now, not a violent person and not a vindictive person in any way. It just beggars belief in that regard. The court looked at this and they found the perpetrator guilty. He was sentenced to an 18-month intensive correction order. He wasn't given bail and he was given an ankle bracelet to wear. And, you know, once again, this is a work in progress. We still have to work through this. The individual cases that we had in relation to offences prior to 1 July 2024 would be 2 years maximum imprisonment. We're now looking at 18 months for an intensive corrections order. We still need to work on this quite a bit. Next slide, please. So this is the actual section, and I will go through it quickly. What it deals with is that we have an adult who's a perpetrator, so someone over the age of 18. The victim is, there are no age restrictions there, but what we do need to know is that it is intimate partners only. It doesn't include family members, nor does it include carers. Where we're looking to show evidence is the evidence of the course of conduct that has happened, which is likely to cause either fear that violence will be used or some detrimental effect to the victim survivor that they can't actually go on with their daily lives. Now, the important thing here is that while this is seen as a test by someone looking at the events and saying, you know, this is reasonable that there should be coercive control and they're seen as an offence, what we're looking at is that there didn't actually have to be physical or actual violence that was triggered. It was just the fear that happened in this case. Next slide, please. So the meaning of the abusive behaviour, which is the coercive control. Yes, we're looking at violence and threats and intimidation by a perpetrator upon a victim survivor. Behaviour that shames, degrades and humiliates people. And that could be done in a myriad of ways, particularly in relation to that non-physical and non-verbal violence and abuse that we have there. Behaviour that prevents the person from doing anything, otherwise that isolates them. For example, insisting that they be home, having a GPS tracker, making sure that they know where this victim survivor is at all times. And also then we get into the situation where even if it's a situation of people wanting to practice and embrace their faith. It's being prevented from doing that as well. That can form a pattern of behaviour which comes under the coercive control offence. The situation that I just gave, the case study, depriving a person of their liberty and restricting them, which controls what they can do and who they can see, the isolation is particularly pertinent to that coercive control offence. Next slide. Thank you. So we're looking at the things that, even though we have a new offence and we do have a maximum imprisonment of 7 years, there are some other things that the legal framework allows us to do. The first thing is the ADVOs, apprehended violence orders. Now, the police can either take these out for you or you can make a private AVO. Normally in a situation with domestic violence, there will be the police assisting in this, and that just goes straight through. And we're looking at numerous conditions under that AVO which are tailored towards a particular victim or survivor. So that's with under section 16, where we can get the AVOs. We can also look at the police powers and what they can do in seizing and making further investigation as to whether this is going to be just an assault, just a sexual assault, or whether there is a huge pattern of behaviour here, which means that it signifies a coercive control offence. There are also protections for victim survivors. When they're giving evidence, they can have their name suppressed, they can have their identity and their image suppressed as well. So they also don't have to see the perpetrator in court in that regard. With their victim impact statements, they're allowed to have agency and a voice in providing, the experience that has happened with them, which is really important because it just validates that this is something that has happened. It's not in a person's head, and it's a situation which has to be looked at seriously. The other things I will mention quickly is within family law, there are different orders. There's a harmful proceedings order. There are cost orders if the court sees that the perpetrator, or possibly a male, is just not providing enough information or conducting themselves poorly in handing over information. And also with the coercive control, the bail laws have changed as well. So bail is not automatic. It is actually up to a perpetrator to show why they deserve to be out on bail. Next slide, please. So the misidentification and the systems abuse, there are heaps of things that are here in particular that we're looking at in where this is particular to people in the LGBTQ community, where there's discrimination. These things happen prior to a domestic violence situation. So people within vulnerable communities have to actually have a higher threshold of feeling like they're isolated, feeling like they're vilified, that they are victims, and the system's not going to help me anyway. And it's a situation which, the only thing that we can do here is spread that word, be alert to the little things that we can do, as Jade indicated, to just let people know that the people who come to see us for help, they do need their help, and they're in a safe place to be able to help us there. So when we look at what ICLC has gone through and how we treat victims, I just wanted to briefly touch on 2 case studies that we've had. And one of them is a perpetrator who was in a same-sex relationship with our client, and we'll name him Bill. They'd been in a relationship for quite a few years, over 5 years, and it was just riddled with physical abuse. But one night the police were called, and it was a situation where the police came and an AVO was taken out on the perpetrator. The police who actually arrived at the scene then went on leave, and another policeman went to see, looked at the case again and decided to withdraw that ABO. And when Bill actually went to the police station and asked why this was the case, there was no case, no reason given except for the statement, well, it would have been different if you'd been a woman. Bill was just like, he left the police station. He didn't talk about it to anybody, and that's when he came to us to see what was going to happen there and whether we could help him. We went back to the police, and it was in regional New South Wales, I might add, but nothing was going to be done until that police officer who had put the charge in had returned back from leave. For me, that's a situation, it's discrimination. It is a victim there who is just not being heard at all. And also it's getting into a situation where we're trying to sort of like normalise the situation and saying, well, you know, these types of things do not happen to same-sex relationships. They happen with heterosexual relationships. It just defies belief in that regard. The other one was Jane. Jane, once again, was in the same-sex relationship. There was an altercation. The perpetrator brought out a knife and said, if you don't do what I want you to do or stay with me, I will harm myself. Let's fast forward to the actual criminal offence, and when the matter was taken to court, the magistrate decided that it was an issue of self-harm rather than an assault on my client Jane in that regard. And once again, you know, there's misinformation here. There's assumptions that are brought into the whole situation, even though, you know, we had Jane giving her evidence. It just wasn't clearly clarified that she had any voice here at all, which is really, really disappointing. Next slide, thanks. So having said that, there are still ways that the law does protect victim survivors in this regard. So whilst we can say that with the, it may be a lot easier for people to exhibit an offence through evidence of coercive control with sustained and manipulated behaviour, we're looking at a lesser, I think, situation of proving the evidence, not an individual evidence one by one, but it's just that sustained pattern of behaviour. We're also wanting to point out the particular points that we need to have for takeaways, which is really, it is between intimate partners, it is not between family members, but it can be more than physical abuse here. There is also that reasonable person test, which says that would a reasonable person in all circumstances look at this situation and regard it as a coercive control whereby a perpetrator is controlling somebody else to their detriment, where they're totally isolated and they can't do anything for themselves unless there is a situation where they report it to the police. And in the situation of our vulnerable LGBTQ community with the other issues that they have, which prevent them from having agency and speaking out for themselves. Thank you. Back to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. What an extraordinarily careful and detailed understanding that you brought to us around the legislation. And thank you for those kind of insights into how this lands, particularly for some LGBTQ plus community members, and how those social constructions, and as Jade talked about, you know, cisgenderism and heteronormative assumptions can really isolate and marginalise the experience of LGBTQ plus people. Such incredible and powerful examples. I'm going to come back to you to hear a little bit more from your specific experience of working in community. But I'd like to go to Star Lady now. Thank you so much for joining us. Star Lady, Zoe Bell Gender Collective, and, you know, in particular your work around the trans femme work has really kind of led the way in understanding some of the particular issues for trans women in relationships with men. Can you tell us a little bit about your incredible work and a bit particularly around trans femme? Really keen to hear from you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Karen. And so I'm the director of the Zoe Bell Gender Collective, but I'm also the lead author and director of our Prevention of Men's Violence Against Trans Women campaign. And when today I'm talking about men, I'm talking about cisgender men. So as a part of that project, I've been advocating for this for many years. I think we first off need to start off by acknowledging the incredibly high levels of violence that trans women experience in intimate partner relationships with cisgender men. And in particular, we've seen the murders of trans women across Australia, in particular trans women of colour and trans sex workers. And we haven't really seen an adequate or resourced response to that violence. Trans women have been historically excluded, I think, both from prevention of violence frameworks, but also the response sector. And so our work in Trans Femme is really, it's about it being trans-led. You know, it's a collective of trans women and cisgender men who are in relationships working on a campaign to sort of like end violence. It's an internationally leading resource. I've interviewed over or consulted with over 100 transgender women and cisgender men. And so also the resources include our voices and include our stories. As a part of Trans Femme, we have a prevention of violence website called Trans Femme, and in it has 3 different sections to different audiences. One of those audiences is for trans women, another of the audiences resources for cis men, and then we also have resources for cisgender men's friends, family, and the broader community. The ZGBC, after we produced the early versions of Trans Femme, realised that we needed further resources for the prevention of violence and also the response sectors. And so we also created a Trans Femme practice guide, and that's responding to the objectification, fetishization and sexual exploitation of trans women and trans feminine people by cisgender men. And that also has a lot of practice tips around how to identify trans women's experiences of intimate partner violence, as well as talking about the drivers of violence. And CGBC also does work in terms of providing education and training to services to build their capacity in the response to trans women's experiences of intimate partner violence with cis men. I think because we're running a little bit short of time, I'm aware that it would be really good to sort of give you some sort of frameworks, because there can be not necessarily a high level of understanding of what's going on in the relationships between cis men and trans women. And to start off, I think it's really important to go that those relationships are much more common than what people think. And that violence is hard, that the violence of the levels of violence that trans women experience are quite high. And what I'm hearing from service providers is they're not actually seeing trans women. So if you're a service provider that responds to intimate partner violence and you're not seeing trans women in your service, there's a problem, and that we need to address that. We need to address that problem, and especially because of the rhetoric that we're seeing in our society that's really vilifying trans women and trans feminine people. In particular, when we hear stories about trans women trying to access women's services and that they're rejected. What we're hearing is messages of you are not welcome and that you are not safe to access our services. And it means services need to do additional work to reach out to our community to make sure that we're safe, to make sure we're welcome, in particular, talking to and forming relationships with trans women of colour who are at higher risk. It's also important to know that that men who are looking to control or who want to use violence and want, have power and control over their partners are looking for people who are vulnerable. And trans women are vulnerable. They know that people are less likely to believe them. They know that we're less likely to be able to access support. And so we're being deliberately targeted. We have to be thinking about how do we not leave anyone behind? And trans women have been left behind. So many of the drivers against trans women and trans feminine people in relationships with cis men, they're the same. You already know how to do this work. If you know how to do work with women, you also will know how to do work with trans women. But there are some additional drivers of violence that Jade talked about, including heteronormativity, cisnormativity, transphobia, and transmisogyny. These systems of discrimination, in combination with dominant forms of masculinity, create a culture where men often feel confused or ashamed about their attraction towards trans women. It also leads to a society where the relationships between cis men and trans women are often devalued or are highly stigmatized, leading to men to feel that their friends, family, or communities won't support their relationships with trans women. And this has a significant relationships on those relationships and men's attitudes towards trans women. One of those is it leads to men fetishizing and objectifying trans women, because when you're not seen as worthy of a healthy or long-term partnership, it can lead to men treating trans women as an object of desire rather than seeing as a whole person. Also, many of the trans women we interviewed reported that men would often pressure trans women to keep their relationships secret or hidden, where those relationships were often limited to private spaces, such as private residences or hotels, or where they weren't taken access to public dating, like you weren't taken out to restaurants, so you wouldn't be able to go for a walk along the beach. But it also included men restricting trans women from meeting their friends, family, or broader community. Passing, so when trans women passed as a cisgender woman, where they can't tell, where people in the public can't tell that a trans woman might have a trans history experience, did impact trans women's access to public dating. But all trans women, regardless of whether they passed or not, were impacted by this idea that their relationships were to be kept secret to some degree. Trans women also experienced pressure or coercion to be hyperfeminine or to pass as a cisgender woman. We know that all women experience that, but for trans women, that pressure is dramatically amplified. We also saw where trans women feel pressured or coerced in regards to their gender affirmation and whether they should or should not access different medical or surgical procedures. And so often in trans communities, we respectfully talk about top surgery or bottom surgery. And what ended up, men were often pressuring trans women to meet their own desires rather than supporting trans women's gender autonomy. And what it meant for trans women was sometimes they felt confused about what would they want, what was right for them, when they were being so pressured or coerced by their partners or about men sort of broadly. It also led to, men control who trans women disclosed their gendered history or experience with, where they might be sort of limiting their connections to LGBTIQA plus communities, venues, or friendships, in particular with other trans women, and particular with other trans women who did not pass, because men were more concerned about nobody knowing that they were in a relationship with a trans women in particular. We also saw, a lot sometimes we can have a sole focus on men, but we also need to understand the sort of like family sort of like context. And so coercion can also come from men's families, where they might pressure him to leave trans women, to leave a trans woman. And this may include the pressure for him to have his own children, like biological children, which he can't have with a trans woman. There are lots of different ways to have families in our society, but families would often pressure men to go, you can't have a serious relationship with her because you can't have children. But it also centered around families, often pressuring men to leave trans women through threatening to, in particular, threatening to their access around children, such as grandchildren, nieces or nephews. Like, if you continue to date that trans woman, I'm removing your access from being able to see, the children, in our family. And these things in particular heightened the risk for trans women experiencing violence. And it was one of the factors that sort of drove violence. And it's why we created our resources on TransFem for people's friends, families, and broader communities, because it's one of the things that you need to do in assessment, because families and their attitudes can either be an incredibly protective factor in the relationships between men and trans women, or it can drive violence. And often we would see when men's friends, families and communities shamed him for his attraction or relationships with trans women, we saw higher instances of risk and higher levels of violence. Thank you, Karen. There's my little passionate little download on TransFem.
I think, Star Lady, thank you so much. I'd love to stay with you, but due to time, we're going to have to move on. But I just wanted to highlight, just how strongly Star Lady's comments remind us that as individuals and as practitioners, that we can make a huge difference to the marginalisation of trans women and their partners by our inclusion, by our language, and by being prepared to treat and work with those communities with the same level of respect. I think it's really empowering to know that we can actually be preventing violence by creating a more inclusive response. So I think that's just something like a takeaway for every single person on this webinar today, is that we can actually make violence less for trans women by creating more inclusive communities and more respectful interactions as practitioners. But thank you for that really clear and specific work. I don't think many of us get an opportunity for that perspective. Thank you so much. And I guess, thinking about some of that deep work, I want to come back to you, Cecilia, because I know that Inner City Legal Centre has done work with so many different diverse people within the LGBTQ plus community over many years. And I'm really interested to hear, what are some of the, issues and barriers that LGBTQ plus people report or you've seen or perceive around coercive control and accessing legal and other support services? I think Star Lady's given us a real insight into trans women, but I'm really interested in hearing some of your broader thoughts.
Yeah, look, I will be quick, I promise. So really the two things that come through to us very, very clearly is just fear of reporting and victim misidentification. So once again, we get back to that base level and baseline fear that we have of these gender diverse communities. They have a fear of discrimination. They have a fear that their services aren't inclusive, because they can't see the signs that Jade had indicated would be a friendlier and a more open and approachable place for them to come through to. They have a fear of how society sees them as well, and none of those fears relate to domestic abuse at all. So even then, that's enough for them to just not want to come and report to us, ICLC, to the police, or to somebody else who can reach out and help them. So that's a really difficult thing. And then you get into the culturally and lingually diverse. Once again, English is possibly not a language that they're akin with. How do they even get to read what support services are available for them? It just makes it so much more difficult unless they've reached out to someone. And how can they if they've been socially isolated? So that's a problem. When we get to the misidentification, this is really difficult because we do see it quite a bit with trans people. They are in a relationship, and possibly because of their physical stature, it's a situation where they'll say, but I'm the victim survivor, when in actual fact, when the police come in and they see a mutual abusive situation here, they're more likely, often than not, will charge both parties. And then what we have is a situation of the perpetrator knowing just what triggers and the mechanisms to be able to not even verbally say something to the victim survivor, but will allow a victim survivor to be a little bit more submissive and not say anything because they know that once the police go, something is going to happen. So, a victim survivor will be absolutely silent when the police are there. And from then on, it becomes difficult because they just don't want to report. What's the use? The system fails them. And also, there's a greater danger in that their perpetrator is still with them. Back to you, Karen.
So that whole kind of intersectionality piece where we're actually dealing with what we know the serious impacts of domestic and family violence and particularly coercive control are, but then we're adding elements that, pertain to pretty strong social norms that are, used against LGBTQ plus communities. And then we add other layers. And thanks for pulling out some of those layers around people of colour, as Star Lady highlighted, trans women of colour, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We know that Aboriginal people have added layers and barriers, particularly around reporting. So thank you all for that. I'm going to throw out a question in particular to the panel. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I really was interested in any kind of reflections about tools and processes that practitioners can use to, deepen their practice in screening for coercive control or responding to coercive control in their services. So are there any sort of tools or practices that you'd like to highlight in there? And I'm thinking, not sure, Star Lady, if you had some thoughts about screening.
Yeah, yes, screening. I think one of the things is you can read the TransFem practice guide. It has the sort of like screening information in there, but also in screening, I think in particular with trans women, it's really important to acknowledge that they have barriers in accessing healthy relationships and supports due to their experiences of discrimination. We've already heard from Jade where they may have trouble identifying that what they're experiencing is intimate partner violence, but also in particular that they will often minimize and normalize their experiences of intimate partner violence. And so as a practitioner, it is vitally important that you dig deeper and you listen to those sort of like signs that are going on and you pull that out, because when you experience discrimination, it's just like you're so used to experiencing, your threshold of what you see of violence is much higher than sort of like, other people's. And so it's just something that's incredibly important to, to be aware of.
Oh, thank you so much. Jade, you talked about minority stress, and that's a term that's probably more commonly used in the research from the US, but that is that layer that Star Lady's referring to there in relation to, particularly for trans women. We see that a lot, don't we, in terms of that intersectional presentation where people are actually trying to decide when to report and which issues to focus on. Did you want to, make any comment on that sort of concept of the impact of minority stress on reporting in coercive control?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we even just look at, if we have a cisgender woman who's coming to report coercive control, you know, she already knows there's going to be barriers to that. You know, there's of course like victim blaming narratives, the perfect victim myths, you know, like there's this idea that you have to, you know, be agitated and upset, but not too agitated and upset, because otherwise you might be making it up, right? So there's already those barriers there for cisgender heterosexual women. So then when you add on top of it the layers of, well, who are this org I'm dealing with? Do they care about LGBTQ plus people? Oh my gosh, I'm poly, you know, like I've experienced violence from multiple partners in my relationships. Like, you know, there's like all of these other layers. And for each thing, it's like another layer of, you know, like it's stigma, discrimination. And you sort of have to decide which parts of yourself are you going to disclose in this thing. It's like, do I just tell them that this happened, but not tell them the context that it happened in? Do I pretend to be a cisgender woman when I'm accessing this service, if that's possible? You know, like I know that I've done that for safety reasons. I haven't disclosed not being non-binary because I can pass, which I don't love, but that's a whole different thing. But you know, there's like, which part of me do I let people know about? Like, which part is safe to tell people about? It's kind of the same as, you know, when you've experienced sexual violence, particularly like in, you know, like a sex on premises venue or something. Again, there's that added layer of discrimination, of stigma, you know. And then of course there's the historical context that until, what was it, 2016, LGBTQ plus people and our relationships weren't even recognized as, you know, legitimate by the state. So there's still a lot of that, and we've been historically and still to this day told not to speak about our relationships, you know. So a lot of people are used to not speaking about it. They don't know what a healthy relationship looks like for us. It's not taught in respectful educations at schools. We're not included in sex education in schools. Like, our young people aren't being taught how to have healthy relationships. And so of course that's going to translate into, when you're an adult, you've never had that education and you don't know what it looks like. So there's all these different layers and complexities to coming forward and knowing that you're going to be safe. And if we're being honest, a lot of, you know, the resistance to even cisgender heterosexual women coming forward, it's all over the news. Like, it doesn't really look appealing to come forward and be like, hey, this happened to me too, when you're already seeing what's happening to these women who have more privilege than you do. Like, it just, the system doesn't feel safe for a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Jade. And I think you've summed up some of the themes throughout today. I'd like to thank Jade Parker from ACON, Cecilia Henry from the Inner City Legal Centre, and Star Lady from the Zoe Bell Gender Collective for an extraordinary panel. We could have done this for another hour easily. Thank you for your expertise. I think a lot to learn, but also empowering for practitioners to know that they can actually be part of this change, and that there are resources around for you to access to really lift your practice to be inclusive, respectful, and to acknowledge the significant diversity in our community from LGBTQ plus communities. I think I'll quote Star Lady, and I think Jade probably said it too. If you aren't seeing trans women in your service, if you aren't acknowledging LGBTQ plus communities in your service, you're not seeing them, it's because you aren't asking enough questions. So that's a real invitation to us all. Thank you for your attention today. There will be a digital resources pack out to send a bunch of resources to you to help you in your next steps in this work. I think there will also be some questions answered. Thank you for your questions in the chat. Our next webinar in this series will be working with First Nations people who experience coercive control. That will be an absolute critical piece of webinar conversation. Join us on Tuesday, the 22nd of July for that session. A recording of this webinar will be made available for later access, so please keep an eye out for the link that will be emailed to you. Thank you for joining us today. Together, we can make meaningful steps towards addressing coercive control and supporting victim survivors in their journey to safety and healing. And thank you to our presenters who've taken us and guided us along that path today. Please please fill in the evaluation form. It really helps us target information more specifically. So we'd be so grateful if you could fill that form in. On behalf of CCWT, thank you again, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Okay, now we can talk.
Okay, cool.
Are we sure?
Yes, the recording has stopped. And
but there's still 57 people who are watching it, so 54.
okay. Recording not stopped.
Yeah.
If we end the webinar, does that